All right, we have covered the first four apostles, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, the sons of Zebedee, and we covered almost all of Philip last Wednesday night. Now these four that are mentioned, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, and Matthew, most of them, there's a little bit more on Matthew and Thomas, but mainly Philip and Bartholomew, there's not a whole lot in terms of extra information beyond being added in the lists of, or being included in the list of the apostles. Matthew 10, Mark 3, Luke 6 are all of those lists. And again, in Acts chapter 1, of course, minus Judas Iscariot, who had died at that point. And of course, Acts chapter 1 is when Matthias takes over the office of Judas Iscariot. And as we noted last week, we looked at the fact in John chapter 1 that there's a similar situation as took place with Peter and Andrew, when Andrew, being one of the two disciples with John the Baptist in John chapter 1, and he sees John the Baptist point out Jesus, the Lamb of God, says, "This is the one. He's the one of promise. He's the one we've been waiting for." So then Andrew runs back and tells Peter, and Andrew says, "Hey, we found the Messiah." And so then they become disciples of Jesus. But it wasn't until Luke 6 when Jesus called them as apostles. We have a similar situation take place here with Philip. We see in John chapter 1 how that Philip is, he's aware of the fact that Jesus, the miracles Jesus is doing. He sees certainly part of this that John the Baptist has pointed out. Certainly Philip wouldn't have been ignorant of that. He goes and tells Nathanael. And there's some dialogue there with Nathanael as well. It's very similar to Peter and Andrew, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And then we notice in John chapter 6 an interesting statement included with commentary from John that Jesus asked Philip, how should we feed these individuals, or where should we buy the bread for these individuals? And of course, Philip says, 200 denarii is all we've got, and there's no way we can feed this many people with what we have. But John includes the commentary there in John chapter 6 that Jesus said this testing Philip. He was testing Philip, and we talked a great deal about what that was all about last week. So then in John chapter 14, this is the only other place that we really have any additional information in terms of Philip and his mindset or attitude. John chapter 14, Jesus is encouraging the apostles not to lose heart. Of course, there's this whole dialogue from John 14, 15, 16, and 17 that really kind of represents the I guess you could say, the last big teaching from Jesus to his apostles. I guess chapter 17 is mainly a prayer to God on behalf of his apostles and, for that matter, disciples. But he says here in verse 1 and 2, he talks about there's plenty of room in heaven, in the kingdom. And God there's a place for you. In fact, Jesus says in verse 2, "I go to prepare a place for you. I will come back." And in verse 4, "Where I go, you know, and the way you know." We're going to skip what Thomas asks there in verse 5. And then in verse 7, "If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. And from now on, you know him and have seen him." And then Philip said to him, "Lord, show us the Father, and it is sufficient for us." Now, I think what Philip's saying here is partly because of what Thomas says. Remember, Thomas makes a statement, "How can we know where you're going? We don't know the way. We don't know where you're going." And then when Jesus responds, "I'm the way, the truth, and life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Remember, it was all about the Father. And Jesus, everything he did, everything he taught was about having that communion with the Father. And so if you wish to be with the Father, you have to go through me because he's the Son. And verse 7, so if you had known me, and Jesus isn't suggesting they don't know him. They do know him. But Jesus says, "You would have known my Father also. From now on, you know him and have seen him." What's Jesus describing here in verse 7? What's the correlation between if you'd known me, you'd know my Father, and from now on, you know him and have seen him? He and the Father, in what way? I mean, okay, spiritually, there's that relationship that exists. There's that. What else? Okay, the fact that Jesus is part of what we call the Godhead or divine nature. He is God in the flesh. Purpose, okay, yeah. They are one and the same in purpose. The message he brought was from the Father. So when you hear Jesus, you hear the Father speaking. What else? Character. And I think a lot of that is part of what Jesus is describing, because you have seen him. You know him and you've seen him. Well, how is that? Because you know me and you've seen me. Okay, that combines what Jesus taught, certainly, practicing what he preached, but it combined his words with his character. And so by Jesus' character being pure and holy and righteous, being full of good works, obviously, and the things that Jesus did, the things that Jesus taught, God's character could be seen in Jesus. And isn't it interesting that whose character is to be seen in us? Jesus, yeah. We should let our light so shine. Well, whose light should be shining? Is it our own righteousness, our own holiness? No, it's the holiness of Jesus, obviously, through the gospel. But just as Jesus was just as Jesus embodied the Father, so we are to embody the Son. And so there's obviously a parallel there. But what Jesus describes here, if you'd known me, you would have known the Father also. I don't think he's condemning them here or anything like that. He's simply describing that relationship that exists. From now on, you know him and have seen him. To this, Philip responds with, Lord, show us the Father, and it is sufficient for us. Does Philip get it? No, he doesn't get it. Okay, what's he thinking? Earthly. He's thinking physical. Was Thomas also thinking physical? Yeah. And this was something the apostles, this is what they kind of struggled with all the way through, even until after Jesus was resurrected and after he's on the earth for 40 days walking around, Acts chapter 1, they're still asking, are you now going to return the kingdom to Israel? Okay, even at that point, even if they had an inkling, okay, so maybe this kingdom isn't entirely physical here, there was still a disconnect. There was still a misunderstanding or lack of understanding as to what the purpose of the kingdom or the nature of the kingdom was. And it's not going to be until the Spirit comes and guides them in all truth in Acts chapter 1 and Acts chapter 2, well, Acts chapter 2 primarily. Jesus refers to it in Acts chapter 1, that they are going to fully understand what Jesus is talking about. But both Philip and Thomas have an issue of correlating that physical aspect of what they'd been raised up with. Okay, they'd been raised with the interpretation or the thought process that the prophecies are dealing with the physical kingdom and a physical Messiah. And it's hard when you have been raised your entire life to learn something a certain way, to then untrain that and then relearn it as something different. And this is exactly what the kind of the growing pains, I guess you could say, Thomas and Philip are both going through, and all the apostles were the same way. But Philip says, Lord, show us the Father, and it is sufficient for us. What's Philip asking? I mean, obviously beyond the show us the Father. Okay, let us see him. What does he mean by it is sufficient for us? Okay, yeah, show us the Father, and that'll be enough. Okay, we don't need to be with him right now. You know, he's talking about the fact that he's going to come back and he's going to take them there. That's okay. You can come back and take us there. We may not understand where you're going or how to get there, but the fact that you're going to come back and get us, that's all we need. Just show us the Father, and we're good. Okay, that's all the evidence, it's all the proof that we need. That's all the assurance, maybe is another way to put that, all the assurance that we need. To which Jesus responds in verse 9, have I been with you so long, and yet you have not known me, Philip? He who has seen me has seen the Father. So how can you say, show us the Father? Do you not believe that I am in the Father and the Father in me? The words that I speak to you, I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does the works. Believe me that I am in the Father and the Father in me, or else believe me for the sake of the works themselves. And then starting in verse 12, he's going on into another thought, but he says, most assuredly I say to you, he who believes in me, the works that I do, he will do also, and greater works than these he will do, because I go to my Father. And it's interesting that Jesus refers to greater works than these. Well, Jesus had done it all. Okay, he raised people from the dead, he'd healed the lame, but what greater works was Jesus referring to? Well, certainly the resurrection, yeah, that would be part of it. But notice that there's, he who believes in me, the works that I do, he will do also, and greater works than these will he do. So Jesus is referring to the apostles. What works are they going to do that's even greater than what Jesus did? Okay, in Acts chapter 2, they opened wide the gates of heaven, or gates of the kingdom, and through that teaching, what did people do? They believed and were what? They were baptized into Christ Jesus. Okay, so I believe what Jesus is describing in verse 12 has nothing to do with some degree of miraculous power in the flesh. Okay, it has nothing to do with what's greater than raising people from the dead. I don't think it has anything to do with the miraculous gifts of the Spirit. And it had everything to do similarly to what Jesus says about John the Baptist. Remember, John says, none greater have been born among women than John the Baptist, and yet even the least in the kingdom is greater than he. Why is that? Well, because of the kingdom. Not that John wasn't saved or wouldn't be saved, but the fact that John would not live, and Jesus knew John would not live to see the establishment of the church, the establishment of the kingdom. He wouldn't be baptized for remission of his sins into the kingdom. He would die under the Mosaical law. And so I think it's a similar type of understanding that the introduction of the kingdom represented that great power, the forgiveness of sins through baptism. Not that the apostles were doing that per se, but it was the fact that they were teaching the means by which one can be saved from their sins. And it doesn't get any greater than that. And of course, Jesus did forgive sins on the earth, on a couple occasions as well. But I think that's what Jesus is making reference to. But when he describes this in verse 9, have you been with me so long, you have not yet known me, Philip. It's not that verse 7, they didn't know him. They'd been with him for almost 3 years at this point. It's the connection to the Father and the nature of the kingdom that I think Jesus is really emphasizing. Because here in verse 9, it doesn't say that he's angry at Philip or that he's angry at Thomas even in his response. But what you could imagine some exasperation. Okay, that they're still not grasping it. They're still not quite they're not quite at that point where they're understanding the nature of what he's talking about. But that's why he goes on to outright explain what he's saying. He who has seen me has seen the Father. So how can you say, show us the Father? I wouldn't say that Philip is asking for a sign because, have the apostles received many, many signs already? Yeah. And is Philip doubting at all? Is he, you may not be the Messiah, show us the Father? I don't really see that either. Okay? I think it's more along the lines of going back to what Jesus said in those first 4 verses, I'm going to prepare a place for you, and I will come back and take you there. Well, that means there's going to be a length of time where they're not going to have Jesus with them. So in order to kind of bide them over or to kind of give them the strength that they need, that reassurance, I think that's the basis upon which Philip is asking that question or making that request. Show us the Father and it'll be sufficient for us. And Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And that goes certainly, again, to that spiritual relationship that exists, but it goes directly to his words that he says, that he attributes to the Father, and his character that he also attributes to the Father. That if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. If you've heard me, you've heard the Father. And of course, the works that he does them by the authority of the Father. Thoughts or comments through that? Nolan?
Perhaps not a huge thing. I'm just trying to think it through. But there in verse 9, just notice Jesus addressing him by name. And there's just a very few times Jesus talks to tons of people.
Mm-hmm.
Very few times. And later in this book, he says, Simon Peter, do you love me more than this? In that same last chapter, Thomas, if you've these things and believe, others, haven't seen and yet believe. So it's kind of the flip of Jesus saying, if you've been with me all this time, don't know me. He does know them individually and address individual characteristics or needs or thoughts or what have you. I just find that very
That's true. Almost as if Jesus, Jesus, I know you, Philip, and you don't know me. Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. Yet you have not known me, Philip?
English literature, that's the way to put emphasis on a statement, is a direct statement to a person.
And then using their name.
Yeah.
And certainly that makes it, more intimate and direct to Philip as well. Sorry, Nolan.
No. This just struck me looking at the scene on the screen right here. So I haven't gone back. Just in my mind, I don't recall Matthew, Mark, or Luke. Maybe it's just something John.
Maybe it's a detail John records. Yeah. Well, and what's interesting is Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not record anything about Philip other than the fact that he was an apostle. John's the only one who records any detail. And that's interesting because Philip is not the only one about whom John records, that none of the others really record much about them. Now, whether this is John in the 90s AD kind of providing some detail because Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're already written and they're being spread, and maybe because those don't have some of that detail, John decides to include some. I don't know. It could be that he did that way, but it's also, there's a reason why he's teaching the things that he's teaching. John is stressing to the current audience in the 90s AD, certainly the physical versus spiritual nature of Jesus, the deity versus the human part. Okay, that these were one and the same together, same spirit. But also the fact that it would seem that because of the issues that were taking place in the 90s AD, there was this lack of understanding about the spiritual nature versus the physical nature. And so John delves into a lot of these occurrences. I mean, think about John chapter 3. What example do we have in John chapter 3? What event?
Nicodemus.
We have Nicodemus. And what did Nicodemus have a problem with?
Be born again.
How can you be born again? Was Jesus speaking physically? No. In John chapter 4, what event do we have? The woman at the well. And Jesus refers to living water, and what did she think about? Physical water. Okay, so John deals a lot with these circumstances that arose during the teaching of Jesus where people just didn't get it. They didn't get that spiritual teaching that Jesus was providing, and shows occasions where Jesus has to help those individuals to overcome that physical shortcoming that they're thinking about, that stumbling block, to let them kind of fully grasp or try to lend to them that help that they needed to understand that this is spiritually, not physical. And so John deals with this probably more so than any other gospel writer, at least in terms of the details that he records. The apostles were not immune to that. They dealt with that issue as well. It was hard for them. And on one hand, I don't blame them, again, thinking at it from a human perspective. If you've been raised thinking about it a certain way, it's going to be difficult to kind of get over that thought, get over that ingrained teaching. And so I understand it was difficult. And yet there were certain times where, given the amount in which Jesus has taught about these things, and he's even said that the Messiah must die. He refers to the kingdom and what the kingdom is like and so forth, that even at this point, they're still not there yet. Even in Acts chapter 1, they're still not quite there yet. But I think Jesus knew that was going to be, obviously Jesus did know. He knew that was going to be an issue. That was going to be a stumbling block. Any other thoughts for here? Yes, sir.
I think a similar thing like that in verse 10. He goes on to say, "Do you not know that I'm in the Father, and the Father dwells in me?" Well, that could be mind body.
Yeah.
People today try and make it a personal indwelling, but the laws of science kind of reduce that since they're both dwelling in each other. That doesn't happen physically. So you see the essence. We have expressions. You see his Father in him.
Right.
We understand that.
Sure.
That's clarifying for Philip.
And we have the benefit of having the whole gospel available to us all at once. We can go back and we can cross-reference other scriptures that help us in our understanding of what Jesus means by that. But, another one that came to mind when you said that, Joe, is John chapter 6. What did Jesus say that caused many of his disciples to no longer follow him there at the end of John 6? You must do what? Eat of my flesh and drink of my blood. Okay? In fact, John even says this was a hard saying, and many didn't understand it, and they didn't follow him anymore. Okay? We understand what that means, but we have the benefit of understanding not just, certainly it wasn't just there is a parallel to the Lord's Supper, certainly, but it's certainly more involved in terms of the relationship of Jesus' flesh and Jesus' blood and the relationship spiritually that applies to us. But certainly there is a broad parallel to the Lord's Supper. But the sense in which that they had was he's speaking physically. He wants us to be cannibals. He wants us to eat him. And certainly that's not what Jesus meant. But another example of Jesus saying things that the physical mind struggled with understanding. Anything else here about Philip? Yes, sir.
Quick thing. Perhaps part of the frustration on Jesus' part was just 2 chapters earlier, chapter 12, verse 45. Seemingly, Philip is in that address that Jesus made. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father.
Yeah.
So now here we are, just a short time later, and it seems like the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course, here in John chapter 12, Jesus has raised Lazarus, and we have there in verse 44, Jesus cried out, "He who believes in me believes not in me, but in him who sent me. He who sees me sees him who sent me. I've come as a light into the world, that whoever believes in me should not abide in darkness. If anyone hears my words and does not believe, I do not judge him, for I did not come to judge the world, but to save the world. He who rejects me and does not receive my words has that which judges him. The word that I've spoken will judge him in the last day." And then he talks about authority, verse 49. And so, yeah, Jesus he'd already addressed this. He'd already taught this. And I'm sure that the apostles were present during this. And yet, it's coming back up again in John 14. And of course, that's more of a private address to the apostles and disciples there in John 14, 15, 16, 17. But, I mean, Jesus has already said it, but I don't think they got it. I don't think they understood what Jesus was talking about. Anything else through the instance of John 14? Okay. So we noted here at the... Okay, there we go. Here, we talked about a little bit about the fact that he, according to legend, was killed, was martyred in Hierapolis in 65 AD. And we talked a little bit also about the connection that some people make that he may have been sent specifically to the Greeks in his teaching of the gospel, and that's possible. I wouldn't base that on John 12 specifically, but it's possible. Okay. So just based on Philip, okay, rather than waiting to the end, let's just talk about Philip. What are some characteristics that we can seek to emulate, and what are some that we want to avoid, perhaps? Again, and there's not a lot about Philip, but I think there's enough at least to have some application. Let's start what we should emulate. Okay. Yeah, in John chapter 1, he, just like Andrew, went and shared the fact that, could this be the Messiah? I mean, he's doing these works and he's fulfilling these prophecies. This is the Messiah. And brought Nathanael in on it as well. So he certainly shared it. Okay, what else?
If he was martyred,
Oh, well,
faithful to the end.
absolutely. And as far as we know, every one of the apostles were martyred, perhaps save for John, who, at least according to legend, died of old age. But he himself went through great persecution. But yeah, all the other apostles, again, that's not recorded in the Gospels, or in the Gospels, or in Acts or anything else. But we believe that he was martyred, and certainly, without a doubt, they suffered. And just that willingness to go through that suffering, that willingness to stand for the cause of Christ, which I have every reason to believe Philip did, certainly is something worthy of emulation.
Shows it's worth it.
Yeah, it shows it's worth it. Yeah, it's worth it. And none of the apostles, unlike the so-called apostles of Joseph Smith, so these men were there who supposedly testified of the golden plates and the interpretation that was being given by the angel to Joseph Smith to write down for the Book of Mormon. The majority of those individuals who were claimed to have been eyewitnesses recanted that. And the only ones that didn't, actually even a few of those that did, but there was like 2 or 3 that didn't, and they were actually Joseph Smith's actual family. So they didn't recant, but all the rest of them did. Did any of the apostles recant? No. No, as far as we know, and I have no reason to think that they did, even under persecution, none of them recanted. None of them said, oh, it was all a lie to begin with. Oh, we made it all up to start with. They were willing to die for that. Why would you be willing to die for a lie? That doesn't make any sense. All right, what else? Okay, he was approachable, and I think you can get that from John chapter 12, that for whatever reason these Greeks approached Philip instead of approaching Andrew directly or Peter directly. For whatever reason, they preferred to approach Philip first. Now, whether that speaks to the fact that there was some connection there to the Greek community, as has been suggested, or he was simply maybe a little bit more, not to say everyday type of person, but maybe he was just a little bit easier to talk to or maybe easier to approach, whatever that may be. But certainly the Greeks were more comfortable, it would seem, approaching him than in the others. And so there's that. Yeah. What about ways maybe that we wouldn't or shouldn't emulate? What would be the maybe some applications where we should not emulate Philip? Again, we don't know exactly. I think we covered it pretty well regarding John chapter 6 and the testing of Jesus to Philip, at least in terms of all the possibilities that Jesus, how he was testing him. But one thing that would have been interesting to hear Philip say, instead of responding with 200 denarii is not going to be enough to feed all these people, even if we go spend the 200 denarii on bread, we can't feed all these people. It would have been interesting to hear him respond with, but you're the Messiah. You're the Son of God. You can do whatever you want. And again, whether or not Philip was actually thinking that and just didn't say it, but he didn't say it. And so certainly not to say that he doubted Jesus, but it is interesting that in the 2 examples that John brings up of Philip, the 2 situations that Philip is involved in, outside of the Greek community talking to him, involve what single thread of thought? Limits. The physical thought process, the physical limitations. Okay, and so whether or not that's an accurate observation, I think it's interesting that John 6, Philip may not have been thinking the power of Jesus in that situation to feed those people. Okay, he's thinking about the money, he's thinking about how much can we buy, we can't feed all these people. But John specifically says Jesus said this testing him. Well, here in John 14, what comes up again? That limitation of that physical thought process. Okay, he's not thinking in the spiritual way. He's not even thinking about what Jesus said earlier in John 12. It's still not there yet. And I guess sometimes we have to be careful. You don't want to be overly harsh in terms of how could they not get it. But at the same time, Jesus has been teaching them for 3 years. And even Jesus, it would seem, at certain points, even got exasperated based on some of their responses. That, have you been with me all this time and you still don't know me, Philip? Okay, that seems to be, you hear it kind of in a certain way in your mind, that would sound almost exasperated from Jesus, that you should at least be able to grasp a little bit of it. And yet they weren't. And so certainly not limiting God, not limiting our thought processes to the physical realm of things, realizing that there is a whole other realm we can't see, but that we have to appreciate and recognize that God is Lord over all, not just what we can see and feel and touch and whatnot, but over all those areas, that spiritual realm that we have no access to right now, that we can't see, but still exist. Nolan?
There does seem, or maybe just for me, a fine line, because at times the apostles say, Lord, increase our faith, and he gladly will teach or show them something, whatever he thinks will help them. But here, maybe it's, I think I've got my faith in these examples, and it's still needed to learn a lot. So,
Yeah, there does seem to be a fine line there between help us to understand, help us, and it may have, a lot of it may have been intent too. You know, increase our faith, help us to grow, help us to learn, help us to understand. Well, one thing that James says in James chapter 1, what does he say? That anyone who lacks what? Wisdom. Pray to God who gives to all men what? Liberally. Okay, that's the kind of stuff that God wants us to pray for. He wants us to pray for wisdom. He wants us to pray for understanding. But in the situation like with John chapter 14, they didn't get it, but Philip's response was, well, I don't understand what you're saying, but just show us the Father and we won't worry about it. Okay, we don't understand what you're saying about going somewhere and then coming back and where you're going and why, how to get there and so forth, but just show us the Father and it'll be enough.
maybe the difference there is, I think I have the answer, show us the Father or whatever.
Yeah.
Blank.
Yeah,
Versus what Jesus is teaching or saying, what you need.
yeah, could be. Dwayne?
Oh, something to take away from this might be that even Christ had to deal with him being a little slow.
Yeah.
And we have to deal with that sometimes, you know. We show people the scripture, we show them things, and you got to sink in sometimes.
Yeah.
Some of us aren't as intellectually sharp as others. So.
Yeah. Well, you know, are you talking about yourself, Dwayne? Okay. But you know, and certainly there is that accommodation of recognizing that, especially when you're describing things that maybe people aren't used to thinking about, it's going to take time. And for the apostles, even 3 years wasn't enough for Jesus himself to help them come to that understanding. In fact, it ended up taking the Holy Spirit coming upon them for them to be guided into that full understanding. Okay, I think they had gotten to a point where they understood the basics, but that full understanding wasn't there yet. All right, anything else through Philip? Yes, sir.
Well, the Hebrews writer kind of talks about the same thing. Time you go out, be teachers.
Yeah.
Somebody needs to teach you the first principles again. So that kind of seems to be the issue here. Jesus says, have I been so long with you?
Yeah,
Apparently he said this enough times that
they should have gotten it.
to have caught on to this principle.
Yeah, that's a good point.
He does say, in the next 3 chapters, I'm going to send the Holy Spirit. He's going to bring all these things to remembrance, guide you in all truth. So there is an expectation. They're still going to need that.
Yeah,
But apparently he's saying to Philip, you should have got this principle by now.
yeah, I agree. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Bartholomew. All right, so we have these 4, and then we have the last 4. We have James the son of Alphaeus, Simon the Zealot, and then 2 Judases, technically. So we'll talk about those when we're done with this. But we have Bartholomew, and I have on here a.k.a. Nathaniel, because there are 2 individuals that are recorded. One, Bartholomew, he is only referenced in Matthew 10, Mark 3, and Luke 6, and Acts 1, just like Philip was. And it's interesting because it's seemingly, at least in terms of the list, okay, that would seem to be in connection with Philip. Nathaniel is only referenced by John. Nathaniel's name only comes up by John. And even John only references him twice. Okay? So of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and of course Luke again in Acts, they refer to Bartholomew, but no specifics whatsoever. It's just in the list of the apostles. John doesn't list Bartholomew at all. He lists a man by the name of Nathaniel and only lists him twice. John does not mention Bartholomew, but does connect Philip to Nathanael, who questioned if anything good could come out of Nazareth. In John chapter 1, in the event that we were talking about before regarding Philip and having gone to Nathanael to talk about the fact, hey, this is the Messiah, we find here in verse 44, Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael, verse 45, and said to him, we have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. And Nathanael said to him, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And Philip said to him, come and see. Now, what we have here, and this is interesting to me, because if Nathanael was just some random person, okay, who, I say random, a random disciple who may not have had any further interaction with the Lord or with the disciples or the apostles or anything else, I'm not sure why he would be named specifically. But then for that matter, John 1 could have easily ended at 46. But John goes on to describe this interesting and strange dialogue between Jesus and Nathanael in verse 47. Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said of him, behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom is no deceit. And Nathanael said to him, how do you know me? And Jesus answered and said to him, before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. And then notice Nathanael's response. Verse 49, Nathanael answered and said to him, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. And Jesus answered and said to him, because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these. And so Jesus said to him, most assuredly I say to you, hereafter you shall see heaven open, and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. That's not to say that maybe Nathanael really was just kind of an aside individual for whom there was nothing else recorded or written. But I find it far more likely that this is being incorporated by John to recognize a little bit of background of one of the apostles. Okay, now we talked before about some of these individuals who had both Roman names and Jewish names. Okay, Greek names or Hebrew names. And I suggest, and has been suggested, that Bartholomew and Nathanael are the same person. You simply have one of them is a Jewish name or a Hebrew name, the other is a Roman name or a Greek name. Just like Paul versus Saul. It's not that Paul no longer was called Saul by people. Okay, certainly among the Jews he probably was still called Saul. But Paul was his Roman name, Saul was his Jewish name or Hebrew name. And so it's interesting, though, that Jesus makes the statement to Nathanael that under the fig tree I saw you. There have been some efforts by commentaries to suggest that this was some kind of statement that had some kind of background in Jewish poetry that was connected to Jesus acknowledging himself as a rabbi. I don't believe that. Okay, that there's some kind of poetic nature to it, and then Nathanael was like, oh, he knows poetry, I guess, and so all of a sudden you're the Lord, you're the King, you're the Son of God. I don't believe that, because notice Nathanael's response. I think there was a situation where Nathanael was by himself under a fig tree, and either he had prayed to God about, show me the Son of God, help me to understand or to realize when the Messiah is here, or whatever. However, whatever happened under that fig tree, Jesus references something that no one could possibly know except God. And that's what convinces Nathanael, you really are the Son of God. All right, we'll stop there. We'll pick up with Bartholomew / Nathanael next week. Thank you, everybody.